So Paris is all decked up, but around 500 kilometers away in Strasbourg, the sentiment is different. It's not warm or welcoming, it's cold and insulting. This city is home to the European Parliament. It's in session right now. And on Wednesday, they discussed Manipur. Now don't worry, we're as confused as you are. The violence in Manipur has nothing to do with Europe or any of these countries, in fact. India says it's an internal matter, but European lawmakers do not care. They decided that Manipur requires their urgent attention. Around 6 parliamentary groups called for a debate and resolution. Yesterday, their wish was granted. The whole thing lasted around 20 minutes. That's it. 20 minutes to unpack a decades-old conflict. But then again, these MPs were not concerned about nuance. Their focus was to defame and insult India. We listened to the whole thing and we identified 3 themes. 3 themes of what was discussed at the European Parliament. The first is to use Manipur as the symptom of a bigger problem. And what's that? The same old backsliding democracy argument. Listen to this.
We should all be worried about the worsening human rights situation in India. Freedom of press has narrowed, journalists and activists have been arrested for false reasons, discrimination and hate have increased. And this is also what I saw personally when I visited India in December.
Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident across India. Those who are not Hindu, in particular Christians, are facing growing intolerance, violence, humiliation, discrimination. We're seeing this in anti-conversion laws in different federal states.
So it's not just Manipur, it's the whole of India, according to them. The second theme is to present this as some sort of a religious war, sort of like an anti-crusade. Each speaker talked about Christians being under attack in India, about churches being vandalized. For many of them, that is the red line. Take a look at this.
India is an important partner to the European Union, but if we as a Christian community can respect other faiths and identities, we must ask our partners to do the same.
Persecutions of Christians are real, and it is our duty to make sure that they stop, also in Manipur.
Tells you how shallow their understanding of the subject is. The violence in Manipur involves 2 communities, the Meiteis and the Kukis. The Meiteis are predominantly Hindus, the Kukis are mostly Christians. But religion is not the biggest fault line here. Their conflict goes back decades to other issues, like land ownership, like reservation in jobs and colleges. Clearly, the European MPs are not aware of this, and how would they be? Even Indian citizens, a lot of them, have a hard time understanding this. So what chance do white men sitting 7,000 kilometers away have? But that is not stopping them. These MPs are cut from a different cloth, it seems. Their confidence does not come from knowledge, it comes from entitlement. So this is what they said. Anyway, on to the third theme, to discredit India's Prime Minister and government. And there's a clear pattern here. Before the US visit, we heard a lot of chatter about human rights. A State Department report questioned India's religious freedoms. It recommended blacklisting India. And now Europe is doing the very same thing. The Prime Minister landed on the 13th of July. The Manipur debate happened on the 12th. This is too close to be a coincidence. Some of the MPs went directly after India's top leadership, sort of like a name and shame.
Since he entered power in 2014, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, has been implementing a radical nationalist Hindu policy, which has had terrible consequences. Journalists, religious minorities, and human rights fighters. He always says that he is an heir to Mahatma Gandhi. We all admire. He takes meditation time. He created a World Yoga Day. He seems kind and well-meaning. But in India, millions of Muslims and Christians suffer every single day because the government violates their most fundamental rights.
There's criticism, and then there is whatever that was. And this is happening way too often to call it a coincidence. You lay out the red carpet on one side, you host a state dinner with all the pomp and show, but at the same time, your parliament hurls insults. You accuse your guests of persecuting people at home. How is this acceptable? India has firmly rejected the so-called debate. The Foreign Secretary reiterated that Manipur is an internal matter for India.
On the Manipur question, Suhashini, this is a matter totally internal to India. We are aware of what the Brussels in the Parliament is happening, and we have made a reach out to the concerned EU parliamentarians, but we have made it very clear to them this is a matter totally and absolutely internal to India.
It's a simple concept. But the West is like those nosy neighbors. They simply cannot mind their own business. Now, can you imagine if the situation was reversed? If the Indian Parliament discussed the riots in France or the collapse of the Dutch government, it would be beyond absurd. But if you think about it, there is a lot to discuss. Europe has major human rights issues. For example, Islamophobia is on the rise. Just last month, the Quran was publicly burnt in Sweden, a copy of the Quran. Their Prime Minister called it freedom of expression. Another issue is the anti-immigration rhetoric. France itself was torn apart by the crisis earlier this month. So the fact is, Europe has a full plate. Their so-called union is pulling apart. But what do they want to discuss? Manipur in India. These European MPs want tough action against India. They say keep human rights in mind while discussing trade deals. Unfortunately for them, the European Union may not listen. Western governments have largely been positive towards India. It's only these entitled pockets that speak against it. But how do they get these platforms to preach? And it's easy to dismiss all of this as freedom of speech, but look at the larger template. It's always against India, it's always before a major visit, and it's always the same issues. That's less about speech and more about conspiring.